Can you tell
Oh,
me?
Stuyvesant. It's nice there, isn't it?
Well,
I love the
would it help
views.
if I say some of her best friends go to LaGuardia?
Oh, I'm so sorry. That was my fault.
So your daughter
No,
got...
well, I've had 3 daughters. One, the one
It's
older
fine.
than she is went to Beacon.
Oh.
The one ahead of her went to Hunter. So.
Oh, my mom wanted me to go there so bad. A lot of Asians go there.
So and to Stuyvesant.
Oh yeah, 65%.
Yeah. So.
Tell us about those schools.
Tell us about your view on Asians.
No. I have a question. It's a little more relevant.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've seen recently like kind of a reform in curriculum in primary school and middle school especially, and I want to ask you what you think like how this is going to affect a student's career in education, like applying to high school and applying to college, and if it'll have a positive or negative effect, if it'll make it harder for students to achieve higher education or make it easier.
Well, this gets back to something, if you're talking about the chances for higher education, it's back to something we didn't really talk about before, which is how admissions works. And the fact is that it's not just, are you smart enough to succeed in college, or do you have the preparation to succeed in college, but are you going to be one of the small number of applicants that college takes? And how can you show that you deserve to be in that class rather than all these other people? Take Bard College, the place your high school is sort of connected with, and they have 500 freshmen a year, right? And they probably have 15 or 20,000 applicants. So how do they get to the 500? So it isn't just how good is your education, but how does it look compared to everybody else's? And many of the changes you're talking about all have to do with trying to get students to do better on tests that are going to look good for a number of purposes, including getting into college. And the only way that's going to help in getting into college is if it improves those students' standing relative to others who are applying. And I don't know if that's going to make a big difference. What it does do is it reduces education to preparing for tests. And that's not what's going to help you succeed in college.
1 second. I just want to back it up. Would you mind backing up with this a little bit? Sorry. Perfect. Okay. It's a better shot. More books.
Okay. More tests are not better, but more books are always better.
Any other questions? What's your view on like the high schools in New York City, like specialized versus like charter, and could you talk a little bit about them? The inequality, like racial.
Well,
specific.
with the specialized high schools, there is an absurd admissions process that leads to the lack of racial diversity. And Stuyvesant is the most extreme example of that. I went to Stuyvesant 50 years ago. There were more black students in my class than there are now. And 50 years ago was not exactly a wild and progressive time. That's insane. And what the city does, what the mayor says, what the school's chancellor says is, we have this system of merit for deciding who goes to Stuyvesant or Bronx Science or the school at City College and the other, I think there are 8 high schools that are under the same testing system. They assert that doing well on a test on one afternoon in October is a fair and legitimate way to decide who goes to those high schools. There's never been a single study done to show that that's a meaningful way, a useful way to choose students for those schools. Not one. It's just an assertion of faith that these tests make a difference. I actually went to a meeting of Stuyvesant alumni a couple of years ago, where we were talking about this, and tried to get the principal to answer a question, but of course it's a very controlled situation. Simple question I want to ask him is, at the beginning of the session, you as the principal bragged about how successful and great Stuyvesant is because students go to Princeton, to the University of Chicago, and to Amherst, and to Columbia, and to Dartmouth. That's how you know you're doing a good job. I wanted him to answer what those colleges have lost by not admitting students entirely on the basis of SAT scores. But he didn't take the question. He had to submit written questions. But that's what it really amounts to. It's as though colleges like that admitted students only based on SAT scores, because you can get a good test on that specialized exam and have bad grades in middle school, and they'll still admit you. As long as you graduate from middle school and get a good score, you get admitted to the school. So I mean, that's a ridiculous thing by itself. But colleges have understood that that's not a sane way to admit students. And the fact that New York City brags about this meritocratic system is embarrassing and completely bogus. They haven't proved anything about how the test works. And there are specialized high schools like these schools in other cities in the country. And there's not a single other city in the United States that admits students by their score on one test on one afternoon, which is why. And those schools are brilliantly successful. So I think New York City should be embarrassed about how they do that. To have schools that are so unrepresentative of high school students in New York in that way. So I mean, that's my attitude towards the. And it pains me to say it because Stuyvesant made an enormous difference to me in my life that I could go there. Because I was the first in my family to go to college. And nobody, I grew up in a neighborhood where nobody wanted to do anything but go to the local crummy high school. And the fact that I got to Stuyvesant changed my life. So I love the place. I'm very grateful to it, but I'm embarrassed that it behaves the way it does. But there was a second part to your question I've already now. I told you when I start talking, I keep going. So wasn't there a second part to your question about New York City?
What do you think of the in relation? Well, you touched on it a little bit. You said that. Well, would you say you were a minority growing up? I mean, if you were a little first to go to college, I think that would be a minority, wouldn't it?
It was less unusual then, but I was certainly, certainly, at Stuyvesant I was in the minority. At Columbia, when I came here as a student, I was even more in the minority because very few students were from that background.
So.
And I guess I was in a minority. I lived in a city housing project. I guess I was in a minority there too. But my animosity towards what Stuyvesant doesn't come from animosity to Stuyvesant. I really love the place.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very grateful to it, but they should be embarrassed. The city should be embarrassed that it behaves that way. I remember the other part of your question was about charter schools.
Yeah.
And how they compare. The odd thing about charter schools is if you look nationally, charter schools are no more successful than public schools that are not charter schools. They have good ones, they have bad ones, they have mediocre ones, but if you look statistically at the charter schools as a whole, they don't do any better a job for young people than schools do. New York, for reasons that I don't think anybody understands, charter schools do slightly better than the public schools um, in helping students succeed. And some people quibble at the edges, saying it's because they take fewer special needs students and so on. But I think there's enough evidence that something is going right in New York in that way. My concern about charter schools in New York is that you're never going to have enough charter schools to meet the needs of all students. And if you give all your attention and praise to the charter schools, you're inevitably ignoring 90% of your students or something like that. And the risk is that focusing in that way will actually reduce the support and success of public schools. And certainly nationally, charter schools are given too much credit for doing things they aren't actually accomplishing.
I have another question. What do you think about going back to minority-based scholarships and scholarships based off of socioeconomic status? Do you think there's any kind of problem with the idea itself?
Well, at most good colleges, scholarships are given out on the basis of income levels for the family, so that at Columbia, at every Ivy League school, at Barnard, at Amherst, and Williams, and Oberlin, all these places, financial aid is given out after a calculation of what a family can contribute. So that if you're from a low-income family, you really get a free ride at a place like this. If you're from a family that has enough money to be able to afford to attend, you get no scholarship help whatsoever. And I think that's an appropriate way to distribute scholarship help, because your goal is to allow someone to attend who wouldn't otherwise. And to give a scholarship to somebody whose family can pay isn't changing the behavior of that person or encouraging them to do anything. You're just, in some sense, you're wasting that money. Now, there are less distinguished colleges that give out the so-called merit aid to students who don't need it, but who have high test scores and so on, because if you're a less competitive college, you have an incentive to try to get better students to come to you rather than somewhere else. So I don't want to name what I think are less good colleges. That's not really, name what I thought were the better colleges. But if you take X college that doesn't have the reputation that Amherst or Barnard or Dartmouth have, they might give a scholarship to someone who doesn't need it, or give a scholarship larger than someone needs, because they want to persuade that student not to go to Barnard or Amherst or Dartmouth, but to go there because the parents are going to have to contribute less money. But the most sensible use of financial aid is to distribute it on the basis of demonstrated need of the family. And a lot of that goes on, which is separate from giving out scholarship based on race and ethnicity.
And what do you think about giving scholarships out based on race and ethnicity?
I think the important thing is to focus on admissions in that way, not financial aid. In the graduate level, I would feel differently, because scholarship money, there isn't enough scholarship money for everybody in the country, so it's a scarce resource. You have to decide how it's going to be used most effectively. I don't think there's any evidence now, as there would have been a few decades ago, that distributing financial aid on the undergraduate level based on race and ethnicity is going to change behavior in some significant way. At the graduate level, if people are going to get PhDs or go to law school or go to medical school, there's still some evidence that that will make a difference, and some of those schools do have fellowship programs that give out financial aid in that way, because that's what's going to change behavior.
Very quickly, since we're running out of battery and time, you talked about TDC earlier. Could you tell us a little bit why you wanted to start it? What motivated you? So we could talk about TDC and the importance of it.
Okay. Well, you can go to the website and see what I said for an hour about that, but I'll try to give you a shorter version of it here. When I was a student at Columbia in the mid-'60s, I got involved with helping in tutoring programs in schools through a program at Columbia called the Citizenship Council. Students volunteered in hospitals and schools and community centers, even in prisons, and did community service that way. And I became part of that and got more involved, and also got involved in our starting programs that we could run rather than just placing volunteers in those agencies, because frankly it was frustrating to go to a school and try to tutor a youngster when the school really didn't. School was making it difficult. They were an obstacle. They weren't really interested in helping the kids. I mean, there wasn't even the rhetoric of these students succeeding. I could also see that what I didn't see in the same way when I was younger. I mean, when I got to college, I got to see one thing I didn't get to see when I was younger, which was that whatever disadvantages I faced, because my parents hadn't been to college, because we had no money and all of that, doing the work I did here, I saw that I still was white. And that made a difference. I was encouraged in ways that other students weren't. I was made to think I could succeed in ways that I came to see later other students weren't. And that was still an advantage. That was not trivial. It was really a significant help. So that coming to understand that made me want to do something. And when we had the chance, because there was funding available, to start a serious and larger program to help New York City students to succeed in high school and get to college, just it seemed like something. How could you not do it if you have the chance to do it?